I had been losing badly that night, the controller slipping in my sweaty palms as Mateo's laughter filled my cramped apartment. The sound bounced off the walls, ricocheting between movie posters and stacks of film theory books I never quite finished reading. On the television screen, chaos reigned in brilliant pixels. Our characters danced through explosions and gunfire, his avatar consistently 3 steps ahead of mine always had been. We were tangled together on my second-hand couch, the one with the sunken cushion on the left side where I always sat. Our elbows bumped as we maneuvered controllers with practiced ease. His knee pressed against my thigh when he leaned forward during particularly intense moments, and I pretended not to notice the warmth that spread from that point of contact. The trash talk flew between us like it always did. He called my strategy pathetic. I told him his victories were pure luck. Neither of us meant it. Neither of us cared who actually won. This was our ritual. Every Friday night for the past 3 years, ever since we'd both landed back in town after high school, scattered our friend group like dandelion seeds. While others moved away for college or work or love, Mateo and I had gravitated back to each other with the inevitability of magnets. He would arrive at 7:30 with takeout containers and that easy smile that made everyone in any room turn toward him like flowers following sunlight. I would clear space on my coffee table, pushing aside notebooks filled with half-formed screenplay ideas and empty energy drink cans. The apartment was dim, as always, lit only by the television's glow and a single floor lamp with a crooked shade. I prefer it that way. The shadows felt safe, forgiving. They hid the uncertainty that lived in my chest, the questions I never asked aloud. In the darkness, I could watch Mateo without him noticing. I could memorize the way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he concentrated, the way his tongue darted out slightly when he was focused on a particularly difficult sequence. I could pretend these observations were casual, meaningless, the way friends notice things about each other. But then, without warning, the game froze. The music cut off mid-note, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The screen showed our characters suspended in mid-action, frozen in a moment that would never complete itself. I turned toward Mateo, confused, already forming the words to ask what happened, if his controller had died, if we needed to restart the console. But the question died in my throat when I saw him looking at me. Not at the screen, not at his controller, but at me. His eyes were steady and searching, as if he was seeing something in my face that had always been there, but had remained invisible until this exact moment. The laughter had drained from his expression completely. This wasn't the Mateo who made jokes to fill awkward silences or deflected serious conversations with perfectly timed sarcasm. This was someone I recognized but had never been allowed to see directly. Someone who looked at me like I was a question he'd been afraid to ask. My chest tightened. The air in the room felt thinner, harder to draw into my lungs. I became hyper-aware of everything. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic through my thin walls, the way my own heartbeat seemed to echo in my ears. The space between us on the couch, which had always felt comfortable and familiar, suddenly seemed charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Time stretched like taffy. Seconds became minutes, became hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few heartbeats. I wanted to look away, to break whatever spell had settled over us, to return to the safety of our game and our laughter and the predictable rhythm of our friendship. But I couldn't. Something in his gaze held me captive, made me feel exposed and seen in a way that was both terrifying and necessary. I'd spent years perfecting the art of wanting quietly, of loving from a distance, of accepting that some feelings were meant to remain unspoken, locked away in the dark corners of my heart where they couldn't hurt anyone. I had convinced myself that friendship was enough, that these Friday nights were enough, that the brief moments when our hands brushed reaching for the same drink or when he fell asleep against my shoulder during late movie marathons were enough. But as Mateo stared at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every wall I had carefully constructed, I realized that nothing about this was sustainable. The one was too big, too insistent. It filled every empty space in my chest, crowded out every other thought, made it impossible to breathe normally when he was this close. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, to fill the silence that had grown too heavy to bear. But before I could form words, Mateo blinked, seeming to come back to himself. His hand moved to the controller, thumb finding the pause button. The game sprang back to life, music and sound effects rushing back to fill the void. He cleared his throat and made some joke about the controller glitching, his voice just a little too bright, a little too careful. But I barely heard him, because even as the familiar chaos resumed on screen, even as we fell back into our roles as best friends playing video games on a Friday night, something fundamental had shifted. The pause had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like a door had been opened that could never be fully closed again. The game could wait, I realized. The world suddenly couldn't. We finished playing that night, ordered pizza, talked about his computer science classes and my film projects, laughed at the same stupid jokes we'd been making for years. On the surface, everything was exactly as it had always been. But underneath, in the spaces between words, in the careful way we avoided looking directly at each other, something new was growing. Something that made my skin feel too tight and my thoughts scatter like startled birds whenever I tried to examine it too closely. After he left that night, I sat on my couch in the dark, controller still warm in my hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. The apartment felt different without him in it, emptier, but also somehow more honest. In the silence, I could finally acknowledge what I'd been denying for months, maybe years. The way my pulse quickened when he texted. The way I found excuses to stay close when we were together. The way I had been memorizing the sound of his voice, the curve of his smile, the particular way he said my name when he was being serious. I was in love with my best friend. Had been, probably, since we were teenagers fumbling through high school together, though I had never let myself name it. And for 30 seconds, suspended in the space between pause and play, it had felt like maybe impossibly he might love me back. I am 21 years old, and my world exists primarily within the four walls of this apartment. It is a small space, cramped even, with thin walls that let in the sounds of neighbors arguing and delivery trucks rumbling past at all hours. The rent is cheap because the building is old, because the heating works sporadically, because the kitchen faucet drips no matter how tightly you turn the handle. But it is mine, and that matters more than comfort. The living room where Mateo and I spend our Friday nights is a study in organized chaos. Movie posters cover every available inch of wall space, secured with thumbtacks that leave tiny holes I will probably lose my security deposit over. Kurosawa films hang beside Marvel blockbusters, art house cinema next to guilty pleasure comedies. My film school professors would call it eclectic. I call it honest. These are the stories that shaped me, the dreams I still carry despite the rejection letters that arrive with increasing frequency. Books are stacked everywhere, spilling from a single bookshelf onto the coffee table, the floor, the windowsill. Film theory texts with cracked spines and highlighted passages. Screenwriting manuals filled with sticky notes marking techniques I have tried and failed to master. Notebooks containing fragments of stories that start strong and fade into nothing. Ideas that felt brilliant at 3 in the morning but read like nonsense in daylight. Empty energy drink cans serve as inadvertent bookmarks. Takeout containers accumulate on the counter until shame forces me to deal with them. This is the debris of a life spent mostly in observation, in the quiet watching that feels safer than participating. I am 21 and already tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. But Mateo belongs here effortlessly, the way he belongs everywhere. At 22, he moves through the world with a confidence I have never possessed, drawing people toward him without trying. When he laughs, others laugh with him. When he speaks, they listen. He has the kind of magnetism that seems innate, though I suspect it comes from some deep well of self-assurance that I have spent years trying to understand. He is studying computer science at the State University, 20 minutes from my apartment by bus, 40 minutes when he walks to clear his head. His backpack is always filled with textbooks about algorithms and programming languages that might as well be written in ancient Sanskrit for all the sense they make to me. But when he talks about code, his eyes light up with the same passion I feel when discussing the perfect camera angle or the way sound design can make an audience hold their breath. We have been friends since we were 8 years old, thrown together in 3rd grade by the arbitrary cruelty of alphabetical seating charts. Matthews and Martinez, side by side in Mrs. Chen's classroom, bonding over shared lunches and whispered jokes during reading time. We survived middle school together, weathered the social minefield of high school, graduated 3 months apart, and somehow found our way back to each other when everyone else scattered to distant colleges and adult lives. Video games became our anchor during those uncertain months after graduation. While classmates posted photos from dorm rooms and fraternity parties, Mateo and I established our ritual of Friday nights and friendly competition. It was safe territory, familiar ground where we could still be the kids we had been before the world started demanding we become something else. The games themselves were almost secondary to the comfort of routine. We played everything. First-person shooters where we could lose ourselves in mindless violence, puzzle games that required cooperation, racing games where we hurled good-natured insults at each other's driving skills. What mattered was the laughter, the easy conversation, the way time seemed to suspend itself when we were together. Mateo would arrive exactly at 7:30, never early enough to catch me in the frantic cleaning I did beforehand, never late enough to make me worry he had forgotten. He brought dinner more often than not, rotating between the handful of restaurants that delivered to my neighborhood. Chinese food on rainy nights, pizza when we were feeling nostalgic, Thai food when we wanted to feel adventurous within the safe boundaries of our routine. He fit into my space as if it had been designed around him. He knew which cushion on the couch had the broken spring, which controller had the sticky left trigger, how to jiggle the cable box when the signal cut out during crucial moments. He never commented on the mess, never suggested I needed better furniture or brighter lighting. He simply existed in my dimly lit world, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. Until the pause, our friendship felt infinite and unchanging. We were the constants in each other's lives, the reliable ground beneath shifting everything else. When his computer science projects kept him up until dawn, I was the person he texted with complaints and small victories. When my film school rejections arrived, he was the one who helped me craft new application essays without ever suggesting I should choose something more practical. We had built something steady and enduring, a relationship that asked nothing more of us than what we had always given. Loyalty, laughter, the comfortable silence of people who have known each other long enough to feel no pressure to fill every moment with words. But now, 3 days after that frozen moment on my couch, I find myself analyzing every interaction we have ever had, searching for signs I might have missed. The way he always chose to sit beside me instead of in the armchair across the room. The frequency of his texts, the particular attention he paid when I spoke about things that mattered to me. The times he had fallen asleep during late movies, his head finding my shoulder as naturally as water finds its level. I am 21 years old, spending my nights in a dim apartment filled with unfinished stories, and suddenly wondering if the most important story of my life has been unfolding right beside me all along. After the pause, Mateo unpaused quickly, covering with a joke about his controller acting up. His laugh came out too bright, too forceful, the way laughter does when it is being used to paper over something too complicated to examine. But the moment lingered between us like smoke, impossible to clear from the air no matter how much we pretended it had never happened. I cannot shake it. The way Mateo's gaze had burned through the room, how it felt less like a slip and more like a confession he had been holding back for longer than either of us could measure. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying those suspended seconds obsessively, analyzing them like a film student examining a crucial scene frame by frame. The quality of light in his eyes, the slight parting of his lips, the way his breathing had changed in that frozen moment. Our routine began to change subtly after that Friday, not in ways that would be obvious to anyone else, but in small shifts that felt monumental to me, hyper-aware as I had become of every interaction between us. When Mateo arrived the following week, He moved through my apartment with the same easy familiarity as always, but there was something different in how he occupied the space. More intentional, more careful, as if he were seeing it through new eyes. He sat closer on the couch that night. Not dramatically closer, not in a way that announced itself, but enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch the faint scent of his laundry detergent mixed with something that was distinctly him. When he reached for his drink during loading screens, his arm would brush against mine, and instead of the casual contact I had grown accustomed to over years of friendship, these touches seemed to linger just a fraction longer than necessary. I began to notice things I had somehow missed before, or perhaps things that were genuinely new. The way he would glance at me sideways during quiet moments, quick looks that darted away when I tried to meet them directly. But in those stolen seconds before he looked away, I caught something that made my chest tighten with recognition. The same careful one I've been carrying around like a secret. The teasing that had always been central to our friendship started to change too. Less sharp, more tender. When I died spectacularly during a particularly challenging sequence, Mateo still laughed, but there was no mockery in the sound anymore. Instead, his amusement felt fond, protective, as if my failures were endearing rather than amusing. He stopped making jokes about my reflexes and started offering gentle encouragement instead, his voice taking on a softness I had never heard him use with anyone else. Sometimes, during the quiet moments between games while we waited for levels to load or decided what to play next, I would catch him watching me with an expression I could not quite decipher. It was not the easy, comfortable attention of friendship, but something more intense, more questioning, as if he were trying to read something in my face that I was still learning how to show. One evening in late September, when the apartment was particularly cold and I had wrapped a blanket around my shoulders while we played, something shifted again. Without asking, without even seeming to think about it, Mateo reached over and pulled part of the blanket across his own lap, creating a shared cocoon that forced us to sit closer together. The gesture was casual enough that it could have been meaningless, but the way he settled against me afterward felt deliberate, significant. We played like that for over an hour, our thighs pressed together along their entire length, sharing warmth and space in a way that felt more intimate than anything we had ever done as friends. Every time one of us shifted position, I became hyper-aware of how the movement affected our points of contact. When he leaned forward during intense sequences, I felt the temporary loss of his closeness like a physical ache. When he settled back, the return of that warmth sent something close to relief flooding through my system. His laughter changed during these evenings, too. The boisterous sound that had always filled my apartment became something softer, more private when it was just the two of us. During particularly good plays, instead of his usual victory celebrations and theatrical gloating, he would turn to me with a smile that felt intimate, as if we were sharing something precious that existed only in the space between us. The most significant change came near the end of one of these evenings, during a moment when I had made some self-deprecating comment about my terrible gaming skills. Instead of joining in with his own mock insult, Mateo looked at me seriously and said something that made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. Then he reached over and rested his hand on my knee, the same gentle gesture from weeks before, but now it felt like part of a conversation we were having without words. "Don't take it so hard," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. A tenderness that made the familiar phrase feel like an endearment, like something that belonged only to us. One night, as the evening was winding down and we were deciding whether to start another game or call it quits, Mateo asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Do you ever think about us?" he said, his voice carefully casual in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Like, not just as we are?" I froze, controller suddenly slippery in my hands. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I was afraid to examine too closely. My heart started beating faster, loud enough that I wondered if he could hear it in the relative quiet of the room. "Why are you asking?" I managed to say, though my voice came out smaller than I had intended. Mateo did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his controller, fingers moving over the familiar buttons with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of practice. When he finally spoke, his tone was light, almost dismissive, as if the question had been nothing more than idle curiosity. "No reason," he said, but his eyes did not meet mine. "Just wondering." He handed me a controller then, the same way he had hundreds of times before, but now the simple gesture felt loaded with meaning I could not quite grasp. His fingers brushed against mine as I took it, contact that lasted just long enough to feel intentional before he pulled away. We started another game, fell back into the familiar rhythm of competition and commentary, but something had shifted again. The question lingered between us, unanswered but not forgotten, adding another layer to the growing complexity of what we were becoming to each other. Their nights became heavier after that Thursday. Every pause in conversation loaded with the weight of things neither of us knew how to say. The familiar rhythm of our Friday ritual remained intact on the surface, but underneath, something more complex was taking root. We still ordered the same takeout, still argued over game selection with the same mock seriousness, still fell into the comfortable patterns we had established over years of friendship. But now, there was an undercurrent of awareness that made every ordinary moment feel electric with possibility. Sometimes, Mateo would lean against me while we played, letting his shoulder press against mine, as if to test how much space I would allow, how much closeness I could tolerate before pulling away. The contact felt different now, deliberate rather than accidental, charged with intention that neither of us was ready to acknowledge directly. I never pulled away. Instead, I found myself leaning back slightly, accepting the warmth of his body against mine, letting the moment stretch until one of us remembered we were supposed to be focused on the screen. Other times, he would glance at me mid-game, and I would feel my chest twist with the weight of what remained unspoken between us. These looks were different from the casual glances of friendship, different even from that pivotal pause a few weeks earlier. There was something searching in his eyes, as if he were trying to read some answer in my expression that I was still learning how to give. When I caught him looking, he would not immediately turn away as he once had. Instead, we would hold eye contact for several heartbeats, something wordless passing between us that felt more intimate than any conversation we had ever shared. The teasing that had always been central to our friendship began to change too. The sharp edges softened, became more tender, more careful. When I missed an obvious shot or failed to notice an enemy approaching from behind, Mateo would still laugh, but there was no mockery in the sound anymore. Instead, his amusement felt fond, protective, as if my small failures were endearing rather than amusing. He stopped making jokes about my gaming skills and started offering quiet encouragement instead, his voice taking on a gentleness I had never heard him use with anyone else. One evening in late October, when the apartment was particularly cold and I had pulled a blanket around my shoulders while we played, Mateo surprised me by tugging at the corner of the fabric. Without asking permission, he pulled part of the blanket over himself, creating a shared cocoon that forced us to sit closer together. The move was casual, natural, the kind of thing friends might do without thinking. But the way he settled against me afterward, the careful way he arranged himself so that our thighs pressed together along their entire length, felt like something more significant. We played that way for 2 hours, wrapped in shared warmth, neither of us acknowledging what was happening or why it felt so important. Every time one of us moved, I was hyper-aware of how the shift affected our points of contact. When he leaned forward during an intense sequence, I felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. When he settled back, the return of that closeness sent relief flooding through my system in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. During a particularly difficult boss fight that had us both gripping our controllers with white-knuckled intensity, I died spectacularly, just as victory seemed within reach. I groaned in frustration, letting my head fall back against the couch cushions, and Mateo laughed softly beside me. But instead of his usual teasing commentary or suggestion for strategy adjustment, he reached over and rested his hand on my knee again, the same gesture he had made weeks earlier, but somehow more significant now. His palm was warm through my jeans, and this time he did not pull away after a few seconds. Instead, His thumb moved in a small, absent circle against the fabric, a motion so gentle and unconscious that I wondered if he even realized he was doing it. The touch sent warmth spreading up my leg and settling somewhere deep in my chest, in the place where hope had been quietly growing despite my attempts to keep it contained. "Don't take it so hard," he said again, echoing his words from that Thursday night. But now the phrase felt like a private language between us, loaded with meaning that extended far beyond gaming frustration. I turned to look at him and found him already watching me with that same searching expression that had become so familiar over the past few weeks. His hand was still on my knee, thumb still tracing those small circles, and neither of us moved to break the contact or look away. The game had reset itself to the beginning of the boss fight, but neither of us reached for our controllers. The music played on, but it felt distant, irrelevant. For a moment that stretched longer than the original pause that had started everything, we simply looked at each other. I could see the conflict in his expression, the war between wanting something and being afraid to want it. I recognized it because I had been fighting the same battle for weeks, months, maybe years. The desire to lean closer warred with the fear of ruining what we already had. The need to speak warred with the safety of silence. In the end, it was Mateo who broke the moment, his hand lifting from my knee as he reached for his controller with movements that seemed almost reluctant. We returned to the game, but something had shifted again, had deepened. The space between us felt smaller, more negotiable. The silence felt less like an ending and more like a pause before something we were both still learning how to begin. The question had been building inside me for weeks, growing heavier with each loaded glance and lingering touch, until I could no longer pretend I did not need to know the answer. It happened on a Friday night in November, when the apartment was warm despite the cold pressing against the windows, when we had been playing in comfortable semi-darkness for hours without either of us suggesting we turn on more lights. We had just finished a cooperative mission that had required careful coordination, the kind of gameplay that demanded constant communication and trust. Working together toward a shared goal had always felt natural between us, but tonight there had been something more intentional about the way we moved in sync, the way we anticipated each other's strategies without needing to discuss them. When we succeeded, when the final enemy fell and victory music filled the room, we had turned toward each other with matching grins, and for a moment the celebration felt more significant than the achievement warranted. But as the next level loaded, as we settled back into our usual positions on the couch, the question that had been circling my mind for weeks finally demanded to be spoken. I set my controller down on the coffee table with more force than necessary, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Mateo looked over at me, eyebrows raised in mild surprise, waiting for me to explain the sudden movement. My heart was beating fast enough that I wondered if he could hear it in the relative silence between us. The words felt enormous in my mouth, too big to speak aloud, but also impossible to swallow back down. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind dozens of times, but now that it was here, all those careful preparations felt inadequate. "Why did you look at me like that?" I asked finally, my voice coming out quieter than I had intended, but somehow carrying perfectly in the small space between us. "That night a few weeks ago, when you paused the game, why did you look at me like that?" Mateo went very still beside me. I could see his chest rise and fall with careful, controlled breaths, could feel the sudden tension that radiated from his body even though we were not touching. For a long moment, he did not respond at all, and I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake, if I had pushed too hard against something that was meant to remain unexamined. When he finally moved, it was to set his own controller down, placing it on the coffee table next to mine with the same deliberate care I had used. His hands remained there, palms flat against the surface, knuckles slightly white with tension. I watched the side of his face as he stared straight ahead at the television screen, where our game waited patiently for us to continue. "Because," he said, and then stopped. His voice sounded different, rougher than usual, as if the words were difficult to form. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Because I realized I didn't just want to beat you at this game anymore." The admission hung between us like a confession, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to fully examine. I felt my breath catch, felt something in my chest expand and contract at the same time. This was what I had been hoping to hear, what I had been afraid to hope for. And now that it was here, I found myself uncertain how to respond. "What did you want?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer, thought I could read it in the careful way he was avoiding my eyes, in the tension that had settled across his shoulders. He turned to look at me, then, finally, and I saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made my throat tight. This was not the confident, magnetic Mateo who moved through the world with easy charm. This was someone uncertain, someone taking a risk that felt enormous to him. "More," he said simply, and the word contained everything. All the loaded glances, all the lingering touches, all the moments of closeness that had been building between us over weeks of careful testing and tentative exploration. I wanted more. The room went completely still. Even the ambient sounds that usually filled my apartment seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of our breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stared at him, trying to process what he had just admitted, trying to understand how this moment had finally arrived after so much careful circling around it. "More," I repeated, tasting the word, feeling how it settled in my mouth, how it seemed to unlock something that had been tightly closed inside my chest. Mateo's eyes searched my face as if looking for some sign of how I was receiving this revelation. I could see the fear there alongside the hope, the same war between desire and terror that I had been fighting myself. He had taken the leap, had spoken the truth we had both been dancing around, and now he was waiting to see whether I would catch him or let him fall. "Forget I said that," he added quickly when I did not immediately respond, his gaze darting away from mine. "We can just go back to playing. Pretend this conversation never happened. I don't want to ruin what we have." But I could not forget, would not forget, because for the first time in weeks of careful observation and quiet hoping, the silence between us did not feel safe and familiar. It felt true. It felt like the beginning of something I had been waiting for, without fully realizing I was waiting. The game continued to wait for us, patient and unchanging, but we had moved beyond the place where games mattered. We had stepped into territory that was uncharted for both of us, where the rules we had always followed no longer applied. I knew I had to choose. The moment stretched between us like a bridge I could either cross or let collapse, and Mateo's words hung in the air waiting for my response. He had offered me an escape, a way to pretend this conversation had never happened, to return to the safety of our established routine. But safety felt like a luxury I could no longer afford, not when the truth had finally been spoken aloud, not when I could see the vulnerability in his eyes and recognize it as a mirror of my own. The week that followed his confession passed in a strange, suspended state. We did not see each other, did not text beyond the occasional mundane exchange about classes or weather. I spent those 7 days replaying his words obsessively, hearing them in different tones, examining them from every possible angle. More. Such a simple word, but contained multitudes. It was admission and question and invitation all at once, and I found myself both terrified and exhilarated by its implications. I thought about all the moments that had led us here, the childhood friendship that had survived every transition and change, the easy comfort we had always found in each other's company. The way he looked at me now, different from how he looked at anyone else. The careful touches that lingered longer than friendship required. The silences that had become charged with possibility rather than comfortable with familiarity. By Tuesday, I had convinced myself that responding would be a mistake, that some things were better left unexamined. By Thursday, I knew that silence would be a betrayal of everything we had built together, both as friends and as whatever we were becoming. The fear was real and significant, but the want was larger, more insistent. It had been growing for months, maybe years, and now that it had been acknowledged, it could not be ignored. When Friday came, I spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation that made it impossible to focus on anything productive. I cleaned my apartment more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in months, not because I expected Mateo to notice, but because I needed something to do with the restless energy that had taken up residence in my chest. I changed my shirt 3 times, each choice feeling simultaneously too casual and too deliberate. He arrived at 7:30, as always, punctual in the way that had become one of the constants I could count on. But when I opened the door, I could see immediately that he was as nervous as I was. His usual easy confidence had been replaced by something more careful, more uncertain. He carried takeout bags and wore a smile that was just slightly too bright, and I recognized the performance because I was giving one of my own. We went through the motions of our established routine. Unpacked dinner, settled onto the couch, started up the game console. But everything felt different now, charged with the awareness of what had been said and what had not yet been answered. I could feel him watching me when he thought I was not looking, could sense the question in every casual glance. We played for an hour, maybe more, neither of us performing at our usual level. My focus kept drifting to the space between us on the couch, to the careful way Mateo was maintaining a distance that felt both respectful and painful. Gone were the casual touches, the shared blankets, the easy physical comfort that had been building over weeks. In their place was a politeness that felt worse than rejection. Finally, during a loading screen that seemed to stretch longer than usual, I set down my controller with the same deliberate motion I had used the week before. Mateo glanced over at me, and I could see him preparing for another difficult conversation, bracing himself for whatever I was about to say. My hands were trembling slightly, and I pressed my palms against my thighs to steady them. The words I had been rehearsing all week suddenly felt inadequate, too small to contain everything I was feeling. But they were the only words I had, and the silence was becoming unbearable. "I don't want to forget," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly in the quiet room. Mateo went very still beside me. I could see him processing what I had said, could watch the careful hope that began to bloom in his expression as he understood what I was telling him. The question that had been living in his eyes for weeks was finally getting an answer. "So what do you want?" he asked, and his voice was softer than I had ever heard it, gentler, as if he understood that we were handling something fragile that could break if we were not careful. I turned to face him fully, abandoning any pretense of paying attention to the game that waited patiently on the television screen. This moment felt too important for half measures or sideways glances. If I was going to answer his question, if I was going to take this leap with him, I wanted to do it honestly, completely. The words came out steadier than I had expected, clearer than I had dared to hope. They felt like truth in my mouth, like something I had been carrying for a long time, without fully understanding its weight. "You," I said, and the simple word contained everything. All my careful observations, all my quiet wanting, all the hope I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. "I want you." It was simple, terrifying, everything. The same word Mateo had used to describe what he wanted, but now offered back to him as an answer, as a choice, as a step toward something neither of us fully understood, but both of us wanted to explore. Mateo smiled then, softer than I had ever seen him smile, as if something that had been held too tightly inside his chest was finally allowed to breathe. It was not the bright, performative smile he wore for the world, not even the familiar grin he shared with me during our years of friendship. This was something more private, more real, meant only for this moment and only for me. He leaned in without hesitation, closing the space between us that had felt insurmountable just moments before. When his lips met mine, it was gentle and tentative at first, a question asked and answered simultaneously. But as I responded, as I let myself kiss him back with all the careful one I had been carrying, the kiss deepened into something more certain, more necessary. His hand found the side of my face, thumb brushing across my cheek with a tenderness that made my breath catch. I could taste the lingering sweetness of the soda we had been sharing, could feel the slight tremble in his fingers that told me he was as affected by this as I was. When we finally broke apart, it was slowly, reluctantly, and he rested his forehead against mine as we both tried to catch our breath. The game stayed paused. The television screen cast its blue glow across the dim room, but neither of us reached for our controllers. The digital world that had brought us together, that had provided the safe framework for our friendship, to evolve into something more suddenly felt irrelevant. We had found something more engaging, more immediate in the space between us on my worn couch. That night marked the beginning of a new ritual, though it took weeks for us to fully understand what we were building together. We still met every Friday, still brought takeout, and settled onto the same couch, still turned on the gaming console out of habit. But now there were pauses that had nothing to do with technical difficulties or loading screens. Pauses where we would look at each other and remember that that we were allowed to want this, allowed to have it. Sometimes we would play for hours before the first kiss, letting anticipation build until it became impossible to ignore. Other times, we would barely make it through turning on a console before one of us would reach for the other, drawn by a gravity that felt both new and inevitable. The games became secondary to the discovery of each other, to learning the particular way Mateo's breath hitched when I kissed the corner of his mouth, to understanding how my own heart could race from something as simple as his fingers threading through mine. We were careful with each other in those early weeks, mindful of the friendship we were transforming, afraid to move too quickly and lose what we had always been each other. But gradually, the fear gave way to trust, and the trust gave way to something deeper, more resilient. We learned that we could be more than friends without losing the foundation that had brought us here. If anything, the physical intimacy enhanced the emotional connection we had always shared, gave it new dimensions to explore. The apartment remained the same cluttered, dimly lit space it had always been, but now it felt different. More alive, somehow. The movie posters and stacked books and empty takeout containers were still there, but they had become the backdrop for something more significant. This was the place where we had learned to be honest with each other, where we had found the courage to want something and ask for it and receive it in return. Winter gave way to spring, and our Friday nights evolved into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. We still laughed at each other's gaming mistakes, still argued over movie choices, still shared takeout from the same handful of restaurants. But now, there were also quiet conversations that stretched long past midnight, explorations of each other that had nothing to do with competition or entertainment, silences that felt full rather than empty. For me, it was no longer about winning or losing, about achieving high scores or completing difficult levels. The games we played had become just one element of something much larger, much more important. They were the excuse that brought us together, the familiar structure that allowed us to build something entirely new without abandoning what we had always been. Sometimes between rounds or during particularly long loading screens, we would pause on purpose now, not because of technical difficulties or moment of uncertainty, but because we wanted to, because we had learned that some moments were worth stopping for, worth holding on to, worth experiencing fully before moving on to whatever came next. Sometimes we would kiss during these deliberate pauses, soft and unhurried kisses that tasted like shared drinks and felt like promises. Sometimes we would just sit in comfortable silence, his head on my shoulder or my hand resting on his knee, content to exist in the space we had created together. The game would wait patiently on the screen, and we would let it wait, understanding finally that some things were more important than completing the next level or achieving the next objective. For me, sitting in that dim apartment with Mateo beside me, controller warm in my hands but forgotten for the moment, it was no longer about winning or losing. It was about the way he looked at me now, not different anymore, but exactly the same every time. Steady, certain, home.